My name is Selena Lawson. I'm 30 years old, and last Tuesday I sat alone in my office in Portland, Oregon, listening to 43 voicemails from people I hadn't heard from in 7 years. Not one of them began with, "I'm sorry." Every single one, in one way or another, came down to the same plea: help me. That was the part that hit hardest, because 7 years ago, when I left my family behind, they told everyone back home that I was the one who needed help. They said I was unstable. They made me sound fragile, dramatic, unwell. They dressed it up as concern, but it was never concern. It was control. And once I was gone, it was convenient for them to keep that story alive. They were perfectly comfortable with that version of me until they found out I was doing just fine without them. Before I get into what happened, let me take you back to where everything really ended, though at the time I didn't realize it was also the beginning. Thanksgiving 2019, Ridgewood, Ohio. If you've ever lived in a small town, then you know the kind of place I'm talking about. The kind where everyone knows your last name, your church, and your business, sometimes before you do. Ridgewood looked warm and traditional from the outside. Quiet streets, white porches, holiday lights. But inside homes like mine, appearances mattered more than truth ever did. At the Lawson family Thanksgiving table, everything always looked picture perfect. My mother brought out the good china, the crystal glasses, the cloth napkins no one was allowed to stain. My father played host with a bottle of wine in hand. My relatives laughed loudly, complimented the food, and acted like we were some close, loving family. I was 23 then. I was working 2 jobs, waitressing at Rosario's and answering phones at a real estate office downtown. I was tired all the time, but I kept going. Every tip, every paycheck, every extra shift, I saved it. I was trying to build something for myself, even if no one around me noticed. My older sister Meredith had just gotten a promotion, and naturally, that became the event of the evening. My mother stood at the table, lifted her glass, and said, "Here's to Meredith, our success story." Everyone smiled, everyone toasted, everyone praised her. I raised my glass too. And like always, no one asked me how I was doing. No one asked about school or work or what I was trying to make of my life. I had gotten used to disappearing in plain sight around my own family. Still, I showed up that night with something important on my mind. I had one question. I waited until dinner was winding down, until dessert had been served and the room got just quiet enough, and then I asked my mother if there was anything left in the education fund my grandmother Ruth had set aside for me. The whole room changed. You know those moments when you can feel the air turn? That's what it felt like. Not ordinary silence, not confusion, something sharper than that. Everyone suddenly became very interested in their coffee cups and pie plates. My mother slowly set down her fork and gave me that smile she used when she was about to destroy me politely. Then she looked around the room and said, in this sweet, pitying voice, "This is exactly what I've been trying to manage. Selena's been acting very erratic lately." Just like that, I wasn't a daughter asking a fair question. I was a problem. My aunt reached for my hand and told me my mother only wanted what was best for me. That line had been used on me so many times growing up that I could almost hear it before people said it. I didn't argue. I got up and carried dishes into the kitchen because that's what I always did. While everyone else stayed seated and celebrated, I cleaned. But from the sink, I could still hear voices from the dining room. And then I heard the sentence that changed everything. My mother was speaking quietly to my Aunt Patricia. she said. Ruth's money paid for Meredith's car and her sorority expenses. Selena didn't need it. She wasn't going anywhere anyway. I just stood there with my hands underwater, unable to move. My grandmother had promised me that money herself, $12,000. She had sat me down at her kitchen table a couple years before she died, held both my hands and told me that fund was for my future. She said it belonged to me, and now I knew it was gone. I walked back into that dining room and said, as steadily as I could, that money was mine. My mother didn't flinch. She just looked at me and said I was being dramatic. I told her I was talking about money my grandmother left in my name, and then she said something I'll never forget. She told me I sounded just like my grandmother, but it wasn't what she said. It was how she said Ruth's name, like it left a bad taste in her mouth. Like even in death, my grandmother was still something she resented. 10 minutes later, my mother gathered everyone into the living room like she was calling a meeting. I knew what was coming before she opened her mouth. With this solemn, wounded tone, she announced that I hadn't been myself, that I'd been having episodes, that the family had been trying to handle it privately. I looked at my father, hoping just once that he would say something. He stared at the floor. I looked at my brother Kyle. He said nothing. Meredith didn't even look up from her phone. 15 relatives sat there, listening to my mother rewrite reality in real time, and not one person asked if I was okay. That was the moment something in me gave way. I went upstairs. I packed one suitcase. I grabbed my winter coat, the $200 in cash I had from my restaurant tips, and a small wooden box my grandmother had left me when she died. I had never opened it. Part of me felt like opening it would make her absence final. When I came downstairs with my bag, my mother called after me, "If you walk out that door, don't expect to come back." I remember pausing with my hand on the knob, and then I left. Not with a slam, not with a scene. I just walked out. It was snowing when I made it to the bus station. I bought the farthest ticket I could afford. Portland, Oregon. The ride took nearly 2 days, 38 hours of bus windows, gas station lights, bad coffee, and trying not to fall apart in public. I barely slept. I held that wooden box in my lap most of the way. Somewhere near Omaha, the woman sitting beside me noticed I'd been crying and silently handed me a napkin. She didn't ask questions. She didn't pry. She just offered kindness. And I remember thinking that a stranger had shown me more gentleness in 10 seconds than my family had in years. When I got to Portland, it was cold and wet and unfamiliar. I spent the first night in a women's shelter, then moved into a cheap hostel that smelled like bleach and old carpet. I had no one there, no friends, no backup plan, no savings beyond what was in my pocket, no safety net, just determination. Within a couple of weeks, I found work as a receptionist at a tiny consulting firm called Hale and Associates. Small office, old building, a handful of employees. I answered calls, sorted mail, scheduled meetings. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. About 3 weeks after I got there, I checked Facebook one last time. My mother had posted in the family group asking people to pray for me. She said I was struggling and that they hoped I was safe. The comments poured in: sympathy, concern, judgment. My brother wrote that I'd always been the dramatic one. People liked it. That was the night I deleted Facebook. No one really prepares you for what no contact feels like in real life. People talk about boundaries like they're neat and empowering, but sometimes they're just lonely. No calls on your birthday, no one listed as mom when a form asks for emergency contact. No one to bring soup when you're sick. And all the while, somewhere far away, people are telling stories about you, and you're choosing silence because peace costs less than defending yourself to people determined to misunderstand you. But in that silence, something unexpected happened. For the first time in my life, my mother's voice wasn't in my head every morning. That constant criticism, that pressure, that message that I was never enough, it slowly got quieter. At work, my boss, Margaret Hale, noticed me early on. During my first week, I reorganized years of client files no one had touched properly. I didn't do it to impress anyone. I just needed the chaos around me to make sense. Margaret stopped by my desk, looked at the shelves, and asked how I'd done in 4 days what no one else had done in years. Then she said, "Tell me what else around here needs fixing." That was the first time someone had looked at my instincts as a strength instead of a problem. Back in Ohio, my family kept telling their version of my story. Later, I found out my mother said I was living in some kind of treatment center. My father told neighbors they just hoped I was okay. My brother posted vague complaints about selfish relatives. Meredith moved into my old place and got rid of most of my furniture. To them, I was gone, but still useful as a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, in Portland, I was trying to survive. Then, slowly, I started to build. I got promoted from receptionist to project coordinator within 6 months. Margaret trusted me with a small community project and I handled it well. Then she handed me another and another. I enrolled in online business classes through Portland State. I worked during the day, studied at night, ate cheap food, wore thrifted clothes and kept going. There was no dramatic breakthrough moment, no montage, no rescue, just years of effort. I wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. I was trying to make sure I would never again have to depend on people who used dependency as a weapon. When I caught a costly billing mistake that could have seriously hurt the company, Margaret promoted me again. She told me I had a habit of checking everything carefully. I told her that was how I learned to survive. She didn't press for details. She didn't need to. By the end of my 3rd year in Portland, I finished my degree. No graduation ceremony, no family cheering from the audience. I printed the diploma myself and hung it on the wall. The next morning, Margaret offered me a project manager role. Around that time, I became close with a coworker named Jess Parker. Jess was sharp, hilarious, and one of those people who made a room feel lighter without even trying. One evening, we were finishing a deadline over takeout, and she asked why I never talked about my family. So I told her all of it. The dinner, the lies, the missing money, the bus ride, the silence. She listened without interrupting. Then she looked at me and said, "My parents told people I was dead." I stared at her. She said it quietly because she was gay, and for the first time in years I cried in front of someone, not because I was broken, because I was understood. On my 28th birthday, Jess pointed to the wooden box I'd carried across the country and asked why I had never opened it. So that night, I did. Inside was my grandmother's pearl necklace, an old photo of me as a kid with a missing front tooth, and a letter written in her shaky handwriting. It began with my name. Then it said, "If you're reading this, it means you found the courage to leave. Good." I had to stop reading for a minute after that. She wrote that she had wanted to leave too once, but she had been too afraid. She told me not to spend my life trying to hold together people who were willing to break me. She told me I did not owe anyone my future just because we shared blood. Then, near the end, she confirmed what I had always suspected. The education fund was real. and she had left legal instructions with her attorney. She told me to ask Patricia. That letter changed something in me. It didn't just confirm the money had existed. It confirmed that my grandmother had seen the truth long before I did. By my 6th year in Portland, Hale and Associates had grown into a much larger company. Margaret called me into her office one afternoon and asked me to become Chief Operating Officer, COO. I had once arrived in that city with $200 and nowhere to go. Now I was helping lead a company of more than 100 employees. I wasn't living some glamorous fantasy. I drove a used Subaru. I rented a modest apartment. I still watch my spending, but I had something I'd never had growing up. Peace, and peace, when you've had to fight for it, is priceless. A regional business magazine interviewed me for a feature on women in leadership. My photo went online with my title and a polished version of my story. I didn't think much about it afterward. I didn't imagine anyone in Ohio would ever see it. But in early 2026, my sister Meredith searched my name online, not because she missed me, because she needed something. A few months before that, I had received an email from Aunt Patricia. She apologized for staying silent all those years and finally told me the full truth. My grandmother's lawyer had created 2 separate education accounts, one for Meredith, one for me, $12,000 each. My mother had forged my signature and moved my money into Meredith's account. Patricia knew because she had witnessed the paperwork. I stared at that email for a long time. At that point, the money itself wasn't the wound anymore. The wound was the pattern. She stole from me, erased it, and then called me unstable when I noticed. Patricia also mentioned something else. My mother was chairing the Ridgewood Community Fundraiser that spring. At the time, I didn't understand why that detail mattered. Then Margaret walked into my office one day and said a pastor from Ohio had reached out to the firm. They were hosting a community fundraiser and wanted a keynote speaker to talk about local development and leadership. "What town?" I asked. "Ridgewood," she said. I almost refused. I really did. But something in me went still instead of scared. So I said yes. I looked up the fundraiser later that night, and there it was. Committee Chair Diane Lawson. My mother. I texted Patricia, "I'm the keynote speaker." She replied right away, "I know, she has no idea." 2 weeks before the event, Meredith found my professional profile, my interviews, conference photos, company bio, all of it. Patricia later told me Meredith called my mother in disbelief and said, "Selena is a COO." Apparently, my mother didn't react with pride. She reacted with panic, because the story she had told for 7 years was about to collapse under the weight of reality. That night, the call started. My phone buzzed over and over while I was wrapping up work. 43 missed calls from Ohio. I sat in my office and listened to every voicemail. Meredith wanted to talk. My father said they could use my help. My mother reminded me that family is family. Kyle had some business idea, and eventually Meredith got honest enough to say what all of them meant. "Please help me. Not we were wrong. Not we owe you the truth. Not I'm sorry. Just help me." I called Jess that night and told her my family had found me. She asked one question. "What part hurts?" I said, "The fact that none of this surprises me." I didn't answer any of them. A few days later, my mother sent an email to my work account accusing me of being selfish. Meredith messaged me on LinkedIn asking me to co-sign a loan. She actually wrote that I owed them that much. Kyle posted online about people getting fancy jobs and abandoning family. I took screenshots of everything, not because I was planning revenge, because I needed proof that I hadn't imagined any of it. Then Patricia warned me they knew I was coming to the fundraiser. On March 15th, I flew into Columbus and drove through miles of flat gray farmland toward the town I'd left behind. Ridgewood looked exactly the same. Same diner, same church, same old hardware store, same community center on Maple Street. Inside the fundraiser hall were about 200 people, and there they were. My mother at the center table in a navy dress, my father beside her, Meredith wearing a smile that looked too rehearsed, Kyle near the food table. At 7:15, the pastor introduced the keynote speaker, a woman who had grown up in a small town just like theirs and gone on to help transform communities. Then he said my name. The room applauded as I walked to the stage. I'll never forget my mother's face. She went pale. My father looked like he'd stopped breathing. Meredith looked stunned. Kyle froze where he stood. And then something happened that I never expected. People stood up, a full standing ovation, 200 people clapping for the daughter they had been told was unstable, lost, broken. My mother remained in her seat. I gave the speech I came to give, professional, focused, calm. I talked about rebuilding communities, investing in people, creating spaces where dignity matters. Then, near the end, I let the truth enter the room. I said I had grown up in a place like this one. I said some people there might remember me. I said I left 7 years earlier with a suitcase and $200, not because I wanted adventure, but because staying had become too expensive in ways money couldn't measure. I said I'd been described one way, but distance had taught me something different. Sometimes the help you need is simply space from the people who keep telling your story for you. I never named my mother. I didn't need to. I said community means seeing people as they are, not as they've been misrepresented by someone else. You could feel recognition moving through the room. Whispers started, faces changed. Truth was doing what truth does. When I finished, the applause was even louder. Afterward, old neighbors and former teachers approached me. Some hugged me, some looked guilty, some just stared like they were trying to reconcile the woman in front of them with the lie they'd been told. Then my mother came through the crowd with a smile that barely held together. She called me sweetheart and opened her arms. I didn't move. I told her she'd had my number for 7 years. Her smile changed immediately. She said I had humiliated the family. I told her I hadn't named anyone. Meredith jumped in and said we needed to discuss family matters. I said I had heard all 43 voicemails, not one apology, just requests. My father tried to stop it, said we shouldn't do this there. I looked at him and said he'd had 7 years. Then Kyle asked if I thought I was better than them now. And I said, no, I'm just done shrinking so you can feel comfortable. Then I walked away. No screaming, no breakdown, no scene, just clarity. That night, from my hotel room, I sent one email to my parents, Meredith and Kyle. I told them I would not co-sign anything. I would not send money. And if they wanted any relationship with me at all, it had to begin with honesty and a real apology. No guilt, no manipulation, no family is family. Until then, the answer was no. Later, I contacted my grandmother's retired attorney, and he confirmed everything. The money was long gone. There was no getting it back. So I decided to do something else with that loss. I created a scholarship at Portland State University for students who were trying to survive without family support. I named it after my grandmother, the Ruth Lawson Community Scholarship. I wanted something stolen from me to become something that might save someone else. That felt more like justice than revenge ever could. After the fundraiser, everything in Ridgewood began to unravel. Patricia told me people started questioning my mother everywhere she went. At church, at the grocery store, at the post office. The story she had spent years carefully constructing came apart fast once people saw me with their own eyes. The pastor asked her to step down from the committee. My father moved into the guest room, not a divorce, just distance. Patricia said she overheard him tell my mother, "You lied about your own daughter. She didn't expose you, you exposed yourself." It was the bravest thing I had ever heard him say. Meredith lost her house. Without me co-signing, the bank foreclosed. She ended up back in my parents' home, back in my old bedroom. Kyle's girlfriend saw the way he talked about me online and left him. She told him that wasn't the kind of man she wanted to build a future with. Consequences came for all of them in different ways. And strangely, I didn't feel triumphant. Mostly, I felt sad, because being the favorite child had crippled Meredith in its own way, because my father's silence had cost us both, because my brother had never learned that words carry weight until his own life started cracking. Weeks later, my father sent me a handwritten letter, a real apology. Not on behalf of anyone else, just for himself, for all the times he stayed quiet when I needed him to speak. I read it twice, then I put it away. It was the first genuine apology anyone in my family had ever given me. Months later, I hosted dinner in my apartment in Portland. Jess was there making everyone laugh. Margaret sat on my couch with a cheap glass of wine. A couple neighbors came. Some co-workers helped set the table. Nothing matched. The table was scratched. The wine was inexpensive. The meal was simple. But every person in that room wanted to be there. No performance, no hierarchy, no pretending. And I remember looking around and thinking that this small, imperfect table felt more like family than the grand polished holiday table back in Ohio ever had. That's what I know now. Family is not the loudest claim. It's the safest presence. My father's letter is still in a drawer. Kyle eventually texted one word, sorry. I didn't answer, not out of spite, just because one word can't carry the weight of years. I don't know what happens next with him. Maybe nothing, maybe one day something honest. But for the first time in my life, I'm okay not knowing, because peace no longer depends on whether they change. If this story feels familiar to you, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not cruel for choosing distance from people who keep hurting you. You are not unstable for refusing to be mistreated quietly. And you are not selfish for wanting honesty, respect, and peace. Sometimes the people who call you difficult are only angry because you stopped being easy to control. My family kept saying, "Help me." But the words I needed were always different. I'm sorry. Those words are not interchangeable. You do not owe rescue to people who still refuse to admit the damage they caused. I used to believe family meant staying no matter how much it cost you. Now I believe something else. Real family is made up of the people who choose you with honesty, the people who don't only reach for you when they need something. The people who make room for you, protect your dignity, and tell the truth when it would be easier not to. Leaving home with $200 was hard. But the bravest thing I ever did was refusing to go back once they came calling, because by then they still wanted help, and they still couldn't say sorry. My name is Selena Lawson. I'm 30 years old, and the most valuable thing I have is the life I built after I stopped begging to be loved properly. My grandmother once told me that the quietest person in the room is often the one noticing everything. She was right. I noticed everything. And eventually, I chose myself. That's my story. If someone from your past called you tomorrow after years of silence, what would they say first? Help me. Or, I'm sorry?